Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back for another lesson on our summary of the New Testament, looking at it on a scholarly basis. Today we're going to discuss two of the later and smaller epistles in the New Testament. The letter from Jude, which is actually the shortest, it's only one chapter, and the letter 2 Peter, which is 3 chapters. Again, two relatively small, short, and even obscure epistles in the New Testament. If you think about it, in all my years of going to church, I don't remember ever using Jude as one of the scripture lessons from the pulpit, and I would have said that a couple years ago about 2 Peter, but I actually, when I was being liturgist one week, we did a reading from 2 Peter. I had it marked in my Bible, I noticed. I thought, hey, I remember doing that. So prior to that, I had not ever experienced 2 Peter from the pulpit either. These are, like I said, relatively late letters. There's no clear time frame when they were written. I have my own opinion, which I'll explain in a few minutes, and they came late to the New Testament. Jude was not recognized as part of the canon of the authoritative New Testament scriptures until about 200. And 2 Peter was much later, even right about the time in the 4th century, between 325 and 365, when the New Testament was finalized. And 2 Peter is one of several letters that have been included in the Western Bible for the Roman Catholic and the descendants of the Roman Catholic, the Protestants and Anglicans and all that, but not in the Eastern Bible, the churches of the East, the Syriac translations, and the ones that were farther east and went on into the area of Iraq and all that. 2 Peter and 2nd and 3rd John were not part of their original New Testament. They've been added since, as the independence of those churches has flowed and has kind of subsided, and we're all kind of blending together. So then they're now, but they were not in the original Syriac-based New Testament. So you can see when we get to them that, they're relatively modest. 2nd and 3rd John are very short, even shorter than Jude. Jude is a difficult one to place. The author of Jude says that he was Jude, the brother of James, the brother of the Lord, which would make him also a brother of Jesus. But that's pretty unclear. And as we said, to make that claim, to give authority to the writing, was not regarded as, in that era, as forgery like we would regard it now. It's a matter of paying tribute to the leaders. And it's relatively short. When you look at James, the brother of the Lord, I'll just share a thing. Once, a number of years ago, a gentleman in Israel who collected artifacts that were found by tomb robbers or just other people had a bone box, which is called an ossuary. And what they would do to bury people in the 1st century is they would lay you out, as they laid Jesus out, in the place in the tomb, and seal the tomb, and come back a year later where there would be just bones left, and they would gather the bones and put them in a bone box, and then store the bone box in the grave, and then they could use the area for another corpse and do the same process. And this gentleman came across a bone box that had a handwritten inscription in it, and he showed it to a man named André Lemaire, who was the leading scholar in the world on looking at 1st century handwriting, because there's a science of studying handwriting. And he said, this is authentic. And he didn't even know what the owner didn't know what the translation was. The translation in Aramaic was James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And this created quite a stir. A Biblical Archaeology magazine looked at it and said that statistically, based on the names, it would probably the James who was the leader of the first church, who was killed by King Herod in about 62, and truly the brother of the Lord. That would be his bone box. This created a great stir in Israel. They actually got it out of the country once just to go to the fall Biblical Archaeology meeting in Toronto, and it was there for an extra month. The meeting is usually the weekend before our Thanksgiving, and they kept it there. And so at Christmas time, my daughter and I drove up to Toronto and saw it. We were only allowed in for an hour. No pictures. Couldn't bring a camera in. They did not offer any pictures of it, like postcards or anything like that. So we've seen it. So it probably was the bone box of James, who was the brother of the Lord. Kind of takes your breath away when you think about it. I had that chance to see it, and it's been controversial in Israel. They prosecuted the person who owned it, and he got acquitted. And so it's not on display now. It's unfortunate because it should be. Because here's probably one of the great Christian artifacts of all time that should be on display for people to see. So that's kind of the little bit of personal background on this. Now, Jude claims that, like I said, he was the brother of James, the brother of the Lord, but he refers early in his letter to the apostolic age as in the past, which would date him to after the death of Peter and Paul in the mid-60s, somewhat later than that. I personally, because of the context of the letter, dated into the 2nd century, 110 or 120, because the point of the letter is to attack false teaching and the false teachers without specifying what they are. And that comes up in 2 Peter also, and they accuse these false teachers of altering Christianity. And then he goes into a very strident discourse against sexual immorality, and he's very familiar with the Jewish literature, including the non-canonical Jewish literature, which are books that were written and not included in the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, like the book of Enoch, and there's an Assumption of Moses, a whole variety of those. I've got a bunch of those. They're called the Pseudepigrapha, the writings. I haven't really read them. I collected them. And so those references would say this person was familiar with Jewish teaching, was familiar with Jewish writing, and included them. So when you look at the dating, thing that dates it to me is the stress on false teaching, because Christianity was a relatively intact, uniform teaching as far as we can tell until about 90 or 100. And then in the early part of the 2nd century, it began to diversify. People think Christianity diversifying? I said, well, wait a minute, how many different denominations do we have in the United States? Christianity is extremely diversified in the United States. I tried to Google search it and see how many there are, and it couldn't even answer it. Google couldn't answer how many. So hundreds of different denominations in the United States alone. So Christianity is very diverse, and some of the churches have a very exclusive membership. Some of them are very broad-based. The Methodist Church allows communion to any believer. Most churches don't do that. Some churches meet on Saturday, the Friday night Saturday, the Seventh-day Adventists. Others have a variety of different principles and things like that. So it's a very diverse. It was starting to diversify in the 1st century, in the 2nd century, excuse me. And so when you get into about the 120 to 140 time range, in Rome there were 4 different versions of Christianity in existence in the same city. One was what became the classic Catholic Christianity, the church founded by Peter. That's still in existence as the Roman Church now. That was there. There was a heretical group led by a man named Marcion. We'll talk about him a little bit later. And then there was a second heretical group with a man named Justin Martyr. And finally, there was a 4th group, which really was the Gnostic Christianity church. So my impression, my guess is from Jude and St. Peter, what they're really complaining about is Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a very difficult to define kind of collection, more of a spirituality than a religion, which became a rival to Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd century, and then it faded in the 3rd century. And some of their writings have been discovered, the Gospel of Thomas and the other writings that were found at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, 1945, are only records of it. It's very hard to understand what they believed, but they had this very complicated hierarchy of spirits and gods, multiple gods above, and they did not think that creation was a benign or positive thing, that our creation was a negative thing from these variety of different forces, almost demonic as more divine, and that Jesus wasn't a physical presence was a spiritual presence. And of course, that would invalidate the crucifixion and the resurrection if he hadn't have a physical presence. So it was quite a threat, because what Gnosticism apparently would do was any new thing that came along, they would incorporate it in. And they can include anything else that came along. So, but it was there for a while, and it faded. Marcion was an interesting character in that he believed that there was a second God, not the divine creator God, who created Jesus and sent him down. So Jesus would not be an incarnate of the same substance as God the Father, as we believe. But he did he was excommunicated in about 140. He did a useful thing, is that he began to compile Paul's writings, his letters, into his version of a canonical gospel, and that got him together in the early 2nd century to help create our New Testament 200 years later. So he actually did serve a purpose in his own way. Justin Martyr was a different group, and he was also excommunicated, and that his, I don't know if he was excommunicated or not. So no, he's not. Let me correct that. That he had a different approach, in that he felt he was very much into the Greek philosophies like Stoicism. If you're familiar with ancient Greek, they had a lot of philosophical bents prior to Christianity coming along, and he was very much into it. And he thought that many of the Greek Stoic philosophers who preceded Jesus were actually hidden Christians, and that they were predecessor Christians, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And then again, the fourth group there was the traditional one, which became the Vatican Church. So when you read Jude, you'll see that he's quite strident on his sexual behavior and misbehavior, which we know is rampant in the Greco-Roman world at the time. And that's pretty much his message. And again, I think that's, you see why it hasn't been quoted much. It doesn't really say much to us at this time. 2 Peter's probably written about the same time. They seem to share a lot of interest back and forth. They almost seem to have been aware of each other and kind of copied each other back and forth. And it's from the same era, about 100 to 120. It claims authorship by Peter, but this is extremely doubtful. Even the church leaders in the 2nd and 3rd century, when they knew about it, again, this book comes in very late in the 4th century into the canon, they doubted it significantly. The language is very different than Peter would have, and the message is very different. Like I said, it came late to Scripture. And when you look at these two letters, you don't find a lot of the traditional Paul things, the salvation through faith and all that. You find, again, in 2 Peter, the attack on false teachings, which I think is concern over the heresies like the Gnostics, again, who denied Jesus had a physical body. When you get into the text a little bit later, you can see that Peter, 2 Peter author, stresses self-control, that we need to persevere and have other laudable personal values that really come from Greek Stoicism, to persevere, to put up with intolerance, put up with abuse, and maintain our self-control. This author, and interestingly, seems very familiar with the synoptic scriptures, that he describes the transfiguration, which is in Matthew and Luke, as if he were there, but when you read it, you remember that these scriptures are probably written about 75 to 85, maybe in the 80 to 85 range. So if this letter is written 120, like I think, he had plenty of time for those Gospels to have circulated and to have become familiar with them. So he seemed very familiar with that in the Transfiguration. He's also very familiar with the Jewish scriptures, and like Jude, he attacks the false teachers. He doesn't, again, just like Jude, doesn't say who they were, doesn't say what their falseness was, but he was quite concerned about this. So this is clearly an issue that was becoming a threat to Christianity in what I think was the early 2nd century. And he warned about, it's an interesting thing. He has a couple interesting tidbits in there. He warns about the non-believers coming to the communal meals that the church offered and basically mooching the meals, eating the free meals for nothing, but not really being part of the community. We've known people, and they've always have had people who do that, who take advantage of the generosity of the true believers for their own personal needs. He downplayed the question of the parousia, that remember the early church thought that Jesus was coming back in their lifetimes. This is clearly longer than that. It's about 80 or 90 years after the resurrection. And so he said, it'll happen in its own time. And he said that a day to God could be 1,000 years, that the God's time frame is different. And it's interesting to hear that because a very famous scene in the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee in the early 1920s, when John Scopes was on trial for teaching evolution. The defense was having trouble, and they called William Jennings Bryan to the stand. William Jennings Bryan was the prosecutor who was outraged at the teaching of evolution. And in question, he was actually a friend of my great-grandfather's. That's an interesting family tidbit there. He was a very good man. He really was. And ended up struggling because they asked him, well, is the creation in 6 days? And he said, I think so. But he said he didn't think that a day was necessarily a 24-hour day. And Clarence Darrow, who was the defense counsel, kind of perked up and said, you don't? Not necessarily. So this goes all the way back to 2 Peter. You find the same thing. A day is not a day to God. God's time frame is very, very different. So interesting to see how these things pop up thousands of years later. He also made a reference that we talked about in 1 Peter about saving the people who were trapped in the abyss prior to Jesus. That did Jesus go down and release Adam and Eve and all these other people from hell after the resurrection? Again, we talked about the old Apostles' Creed, which I did, had Jesus descending into hell. The Methodist Church has not done that. That's been dropped even from the modern creed. So it's interesting you find these two references, and this again that was a point of medieval concern. They even did artistic drawings about Jesus going down and releasing the Adam and Eve and the other pre-Christian people from hell. And then he does date himself and shows he's not from clearly Peter the Apostle, because in the 3rd chapter, 17th or 18th verses, he refers to the importance of Paul's letters, like he had studied them, and refers to them as scripture. And you need to remember that Peter and Paul were rivals, not enemies, but they were not friends, but they were rivals. And a lot of Paul's complaints in Galatians and the other letters was the way Peter would come in behind him after he had converted the Gentile Christians. So to me, that dates this letter significantly later into the 120. And I did have a friend who watched the last one and wondered about, had I heard of the legend that Peter was crucified upside down at his request because he said he wasn't worthy to be crucified the same way as Jesus. It's a nice legend. I doubt it. Why would the Romans let this prisoner tell them what they were going to do in his execution? As nasty as the Roman Empire was, particularly to a person to them as insignificant as Peter, they would just put him up there and that would be the end of it. So I think it's a nice legend, but I doubt those things, that these legends tend to grow. And I know even of my Scottish ancestry, I doubt that St. Andrew was crucified on an X in Scotland, which of course was outside the Roman Empire at that time and would be unavailable to them. So a lot of these legends grow up that are very romanticized, but not at this point. So these two relatively obscure letters are brief and really show that even in the 2nd century, which is where I date them, that Christianity was beginning to suffer the stresses of other people adapting it away from what we now take as Orthodox belief and make their own adaptations to it. And this was threatening that Christianity struggled with it and survived and thrived and prospered. So we'll stop here. Next week we'll do the 3 letters of John, which are one reasonable letter and 2 very brief ones. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie. Thank you very much.